the big question that I have is, can we have a science of technology disruption? That's my question. That is the organizing idea behind this seminar. This is my question, and it's an open question. So that's what I'd like to talk about. I thought I would introduce a few ideas, maybe some framing for how to think through this, and then have a fairly open-ended discussion, I hope, for a big chunk of the time that we have here. And with luck, we'll get a sense of which direction to go, which directions to go in if we explore further in future sessions and so forth. But this is the big question. Can we have a science of technology disruption? And so to think about that, I think there are some sub-questions to ask first, right? Obviously one is, what is a science? And we can just kind of deal with that real briefly here. A second is, what is technology? Okay. And what is disruption? So we need to have a bit of a sense, I think, of these three ideas in order to begin approaching the question of, can we have a science of technology disruption? So I don't want to turn this into some deep dive into philosophy of science, and that's nowhere near my expertise anyway. But my general approach to thinking about what a science is, and to thinking scientifically more generally, is I like Karl Popper and his sort of take on things. I like David Deutsch very much, who's elaborated quite a bit on Popper's original work. And so I like personally, and obviously this is an open discussion, so we can debate it. Although I recommend we don't get bogged down in this particular question to start with. But where I'm coming from with this is that I prefer to think of science as the search for good explanations. I think that that's a really useful and very powerful lens through which to think about science and scientific method. I mean, empiricism certainly plays a role. Induction and deduction and other logical inference certainly plays a role. But I tend to see things at bedrock being really about explaining phenomena. And like that framework for its practicality, I suppose, and its elegance. So I think it has a lot to commend it. There are other ways to think about philosophy of science, but I think that's a particularly good one. With this in mind, there are sort of two things that Popper talks about, and that those of us who receive postgraduate training in the social, environmental sciences, that's my experience. We are trained to understand that two things are necessary here. One is to have theory. The second is to have evidence. And so, in order to be doing science, as it were, which by my lights is to be searching for good explanations for phenomena, you need a theory which provides you with an explanatory framework. Again, I don't want to get bogged down in details about model versus theory versus theoretical framework. These are debated nuances. But really, a theory is at least in my mind, is the set of one or more, a set of explanations, a conjectured explanations, for the processes and dynamics that govern a specific phenomenon. So, it usually has some features like has logical rationale, it has logical consistency, it is parsimonious. These are things that make a theory attractive, and they tend to be associated with theories that offer good explanatory power, as opposed to bad theories like Zeus did it or something like that would be probably not a very good theory for most scientific phenomenon. things that'll be familiar to everybody, or that decent theory makes testable, falsifiable, preferably claims, and ideally, not always, but ideally, predictions that are useful or testable as well. And then, as far as evidence goes, this is pretty open-ended. It's basically any observation of the phenomenon we're interested in. Quantitative data can be helpful, but it is not truly essential for science. And lots of great scientific work, especially historically, done without much quantification at all. I mean, a good example might be, Darwin's work on evolution by natural selection, for example. It wasn't very quantitative, but it was still superb. So that's my super short take on what is science, and I'll return to those two things: a theory, or rather a theoretical framework, however you prefer to think about it, and a body of evidence. I'll return to that in a bit when I just talk a little bit more about what we do at Rethink X. That's the first question, just super quickly. Second one to ask is, what is technology? Now, my personal preferred definition is that technology is a form of knowledge. I think it's I think it tends to be characterized in quite a narrower view than that. Often, sort of widgets and gizmos and gadgets kind of thing. I like to think of technology in a very broad sense. It's know-how, it's practical knowledge, and so that can be software, it can be hardware, it can be all sorts of intangible things, like the knowledge that's embedded in institutions or norms and so forth. All of these, in my mind, do generally fit into this more broad definition of technology being a form of knowledge. Not all knowledge is practical, so not all knowledge is technology per se. I think that really cuts to the essence of what a technology is. And a tool is perhaps a synonym that's useful if you can think of tools being very broad that way: mental tools, software as tools, beyond just hardware, hammers and shovels and that kind of thing. And to kind of elaborate on that a little bit, a follow-on question to ask, or to at least to think about, is what is technological progress? Like, what's the difference between advanced technology and a primitive technology, or an old, or poor, or suboptimal technology and a new or better or more optimal technology? What there seems to be some sort of characteristic there, perhaps multidimensional, that that we can look at. Maybe we can measure it. Maybe it might depend. But there is perhaps some important sense in which technology gets better. And I don't have a perfect way of operationalizing that. It probably has to do with things like the speed and the scale and the precision with which we can undertake a transformation of the material universe that we find ourselves in. Oh yeah, sure. Sorry, I'm not seeing anybody. I'm staring at the whiteboard. And please feel free to just jump in at any moment. I'm again, this is really a seminar rather than lecture kind of style. I'm happy to just be interrupted at any moment. So jump in and ask.
I wanted to ask about this definition of technology. So could you repeat, what is it exactly that's the essence? Is it the knowledge, like the know-how, or is it the tool that kind of comes from that or assists that or something?
Yeah, I think of it as the knowledge itself, because the tools are really in so many ways an embodiment of the knowledge that's behind them. And so it's actually a great question, because I'm going to give you a funny example. I don't know if you guys and gals have noticed this. You can purchase items. It could be a literal tool like a hammer or something like that, or it could be just some object, some artifact. You can purchase something that's cheap. that's kind of junky, and it doesn't quite work. It doesn't work as well as a high quality version of that same tool or product or whatever would work. It's almost like, well, it's small differences. Like why would you make something junky that falls apart when you could make something that's better, for example? And if you think of any gadget or tool as the embodiment of knowledge and its functioning, then you could say, well, the tool itself could be better or worse. It could do its job better or worse. But is that specific embodiment of it the technology, or is the knowledge behind it, the understanding and the explanation for why that particular embodiment was intended to be able to produce an outcome of a given kind? I think that's an example of why I think, because you can have sort of better and worse embodiments of a technology, and we have them all, in our ordinary lives. That's kind of why I think the knowledge is really what's essential underneath the technologies themselves.
So, for example, with a hammer, I think you mentioned. So, the idea using a hammer-shaped object of some quality, maybe better or worse, I can hit a nail into a piece of wood. That is a technology. That idea.
Yes. So the idea, so embodied in the hammer are a whole set of ideas, right? That driven fasteners can be used to join things, and that there are better or worse ways to drive fasteners.
But that can't be quite right, because I can have the idea of an artificial general intelligence, but in a sci-fi novel, it's not a technology until I have a means of actually achieving it, right? So,
actually, related to this, I was going to ask, what about the?
Yeah, you guys, I think you put a really good additional element attached to that knowledge, which is that there's knowledge of processes and functions, but also of how to execute those. So how enactment of the enactment of the transformation using a tool is separate from the enactment of the creation of the tool. I would say that both of those things are constituents of practical knowledge, of know-how. Yeah.
Okay,
so I often think of this in very simple terms. So say, for example, a traditional potter, somebody who makes pots, collects the clay and spins pots on a wheel. And you would think, okay, well, pottery is a technology. What goes into that? Well, it's not just how a pot gets used and what its usefulness is, also the knowledge about how to make it and what distinguishes a good pot from a bad pot and so forth. So, sure, yeah, and I think for you, I'm sure I'm not the only person in here who's played Civ in the Civ series, right? Civilization, but other games like that. But the idea that technology is a tree, I think is a reasonably decent metaphor, and that knowledge is a tree as well. That you can trace the lineage of knowledge and technology back through its precursors. You can trace it back through its branches. There are definitely sort of contingent. I guess the difference there is, unlike a literal tree, is that you have fusions. You have where the branches can rejoin and so on, which is a little bit more like lineage than like a literal tree. But definitely that those chains are there for sure.
I guess for this audience, this conversation made me think of logic. So, okay, you can think of maybe propositions as knowledge, and in a similar way, maybe you can think of technologies as like logical formulas. And so a hammer.
Well, I think a proposition is more like the idea of an AGI, right? So maybe the proof is more like knowledge.
Okay. Yeah. But I was thinking, okay, you mentioned, well, if I go back to the hammer, maybe the idea of if I have a hammer, then I can do this with it is kind of like an implication. And to actually action that, then you need a proof that gets you to actually have the hammer. And then you can actually achieve what you wanted, which was to fasten something. That's the consequence of the implication. but you need
Interesting.
A, and A implies B in order to get B.
That may well be a powerful. I'll have to think more about that. I don't know whether that functions as a metaphor or whether it's good enough to be like sort of almost a literal formalization of it.
Yeah,
I'll have to think.
I'm thinking of
about
it as a metaphor at the moment, but yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting though. It really is. I mean, and one. So there were two other things to add to this definition before I press on a little bit here because I don't want to run out of time. But one other thing is to think about, are there dimensions along which this knowledge progresses? And so thinking of the chain or a tree or something like that might be one way to sort of operationalize and measure progress. I mentioned the speed and the scale and the precision with which we can execute transformations. So I often think of technology and the practical element in practical knowledge. Practical element is that we are deliberately transforming the state of the universe that we find from a less desirable into a more desirable state. And it's technology, the practical dimension of it is that intentional transformation. We see the world as one way and we wish it were another, and so we transform it, and we transform it using our knowledge. And you could then think, okay, well, how would you measure that transformation? And you could say, well, how fast did it occur? What was the speed of the transformation? What scale of transformations are achievable? And with what precision are transformations achievable? And maybe certainly a combination of all of those. But I think those, and I'm sure there are probably other dimensions to think about. But that's one thing to add into this picture here is if we are talking about making transformations using knowledge, and not all transformations are equal. We can operationalize and compare metrics of those transformations. So that's one thing to think about. And then something that Dan and I talked about not long ago, just recently, was the idea that maybe you could think of it in terms of error, like a primitive technology achieves the transformation, but inefficiently, with lots of error along the way. And a better technology is one that can achieve the transformation that's desired, but that has less inefficiency, less loss, less unintended consequences, less error along the way. And so there's something about that, about an error reduction in that process that also seems to be relevant somehow. So fascinating, but I don't want to get us to get too bogged down in that. It's just that I think these are questions that are worth asking if we're really trying to dig into this larger question of, can we have a science of this stuff? The third question.
I don't want to keep you too long here because, like you said, you should move on. But I wanted to quickly comment that you mentioned basically in your definition of sort of like something practical, that you're moving the universe from a less desirable state to a more desirable state. When you say desirable, I'm assuming you're basically meaning kind of by definition, like we just have some goal and that is what defines what is desirable.
No, exactly. I'm not sure that there at this point there's a way to make any objective claims about desirability. And certainly that's above my pay grade as far as like moral realism or some other element of philosophy there. That I wouldn't dare go near. But I think just for purely practical purposes at the level of human experience today, we look around and we wish the world right around us were different in some way. And that's basically how we construct concepts of goals, or maybe how we construct concepts of problems and solving those problems. It's to transform the world that's right around us in some way that moves us towards something that we would define as desirable, and not certainly in any objective sense that I can see.
But that goal, it seems to come from outside of this theory.
Yes, I would say so for sure at this point. I mean, and again, I think that probably would very quickly take you into territory philosophical
Yeah.
territory that I would be scared to go anywhere near.
Yeah, I think kind of in general that it's good to like keep that explicit, because otherwise kind of abdicating responsibility for this kind of issue, even though it's really thorny, can lead to more problems. Like it can lead to technology being misused, for example, or something like that. So
yeah,
I think
absolutely.
it's important to kind of address this, even if we're not going to solve it, just like be aware of it explicitly.
Sure, and I would I mean, again, you would probably end up having to do an exploration about what goals are and what solutions even look like, or what viable transformations even look like. And certainly we can imagine, I mean, all of us know this, that goals can be incommensurate with one another, right? So you can have multiple goals, and the achievement of one undermines the other directly or partially. You know, goals are not congruent. They can be completely orthogonal to one another, or they can run completely contrary to one another, and all sorts of combinations. Complexity there. So yeah, getting into goals and values and all of that stuff is definitely that's getting down into the philosophical weeds that that's certainly enough to frighten me off. But definitely certainly something worth thinking about, and I suppose a very mature science of technology disruption would need to also be fully engaged with the philosophy of understanding goals and values. It's a good point. Okay. Oh, wait a minute. I got disconnected. Let me see if I can reconnect here. I got booted out of Roblox. 1 second. Oh shoot. I'm sorry. I was still for too long. Can I? Ooh. You see this on the board? Okay. Now I was able to click on the board from way down here at the teleportation gate. So I'm not going to waste your time by walking up to the top of the mountain. I'll just click from here. Okay. So the next question is, what is disruption? So I think this is hopefully a little bit shallower of a discussion than the other ones. But the way that my research group defines this is a disruption is it's essentially a rapid and nonlinear regime shift within to be within an industry or a sector of the economy or a society as a whole. That's a shift from an older technology or suite of technologies in predominant use to a newer technology or suite of technologies in predominant use. And what we've seen over the last, certainly since the Industrial Revolution, and actually many dozens of cases before that, although those are difficult to quantify, we've seen that this occurs when a new technology or a convergence of multiple technologies emerges that is either directly comparable or superior in its capabilities to execute these sorts of transformations that we talked about at a significantly lower cost than the older technologies. So that seems to be these seem to be the key features and trigger of a technology disruption. So it's important to note that not all technological change is disruptive. Some technologies do remain static for a very, very long period of time, or they can just have very modest marginal improvements that do not trigger a regime shift in an industry or a sector or a society. So technological change writ large is different. It's more than just disruption. So I don't want anybody to think that we're saying that this happens with every technology that comes along. But what we do see is that for many examples of technologies, and it's quite often the convergence of several into a suite of technologies, that when this new capability emerges that's cheaper, that does trigger a surprisingly swift change, and hence the term disruption. And so this is it's an interesting phenomenon because it's the impacts of transforming an industry or a sector, implications and impacts of that can be substantial. And Yeah, that's the working definition that my group uses for what a disruption is. And you can get more specific. You look at things through, specifically through an economic or financial lens, or the lens of business or entrepreneurialism, or if you look at things through a social lens or something like that. So you can add nuances, but the big picture is that you get rapid change, nonlinear, and as far as we can tell, virtually always some sort of sigmoid function. So the nature of the nonlinearity is that it follows the general a lower rate of change followed by a higher rate of change followed by a lower rate of change. So that if you were to think of that, that would just sort of give you a crude bell-shaped curve over time, and the if you were to measure the cumulative effect of that, or the integral, or however you want to look at it, you could see a sigmoid coming out of that for something like the share of an industry or a market that is dominated by the new technology over time. So starts out small, suddenly you get a surge that looks exponential, and then you get some decay towards some asymptote, some limit at the top of the sigmoid. So that is our idea of what disruption is. And I think this. So that's this anyway. So that's sort of the three big questions here. And from there, you can then say, okay, well, what would a science of technology disruption look like? What would we have? What would the constituents of that be? And so it follows from what sorry, go ahead.
One question about what is disruption. You mentioned kind of two things. There's kind of this rapid nonlinear change, but then you also mentioned maybe this is because it's cheaper or something like that.
Yeah, it's usually substantially cheaper. Like it has to be. What we don't see are these sorts of changes occurring when a new product is sort of a little bit better. It has to be quite separate. It has to be quite compelling, and especially compelling economically.
So that's separate from the question of what is disruption. Like the definition of disruption doesn't include cheapness, right? If you had for some reason something that was actually more expensive, but still everyone converted to it rapidly, surely you would still consider that to be disruption.
Yes, you're right. I mean, in principle, I suppose. Yeah, it's a very good point.
I've got another example.
Yeah, so what I would love to see would be to see examples that sort of buck this general pattern that we tend to see.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the general pattern is probably like some kind of theory that comes out of the science. But to me, it seems like you could maybe consider applying this to situations where like economics is not as prominent. So I'm actually thinking of something, if you go way back to like the Stone Age, where you have the evolution of ways that people turned stones into tools, or the material, the type of stone they were using, like from just rocks to flint to obsidian and these kinds of things. I mean, there's no concept of cheaper in terms of monetary value, because these are societies before, as far as we can tell, currency. But maybe you have some like less effort or more effectiveness of the tools that you make or something like that. And you still end up with maybe not rapid in today's standards, but maybe you could call these disruptions, because it seems like after some time, this technology kind of takes over.
Yes, so I think that's a great point, and I think probably what would be needed there. And this is great. This is excellent, superb insight. I mean, I know that our body of examples that we have includes ancient ones, including several Neolithic ones. I think I mentioned arrowheads as an example to Dan in a conversation long ago. But I think probably we would have to be a bit more expansive in what we mean by cost, to include some of the things you said. So something like, it could even be something like opportunity cost, like the time taken that you have to spend doing yeah, the time it would take to, for example, to chip a new arrowhead or hand axe head or something like that would be, there would be an opportunity cost there compared to the older technology, even if there weren't anything remotely resembling what we would think of as a monetary or financial or token or currency cost or trade cost. So we probably have to be pretty expansive with how we think about cost there. And it might be that all of that can somehow, in some way, reduce. It might be reduced to time, or time plus error, or time plus effort.
It probably comes back to
efficiency in some way. I mean, we could, it'd be neat to see if we could reduce that down to really essentials.
I think it possibly comes back to just whatever people are making their decisions based on, which has got to be some kind of like perceived effort or like or sort of alignment with their values, because this is all about people making choices between technologies, like people switching from one technology that they have used to another technology as a choice, whether or not that's because this one costs less, or because this one is going to take less time, or because this one is going to be more effective.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then I can also think of examples where they could be counterproductive, but still the choices are made. So, for example, what about fashion? And, taste in certain things, like you could even have something like down.
Yeah.
I think
Sorry to interrupt, but I think it's important to distinguish between technological disruption and disruption. I mean, so you could have many kind of transitions in people's behavior that have nothing to do with technology or knowledge. And one shouldn't really expect any scientific description of the phenomena of technological disruption to necessarily also apply to those.
Yeah.
I think, the role of knowledge, you could consider a disruption which is simply due to one country, say, discovering a hidden cache of raw materials so that the cost of production of a given good is way lower there or something. You could certainly disrupt an economy or have a disruption where one product replaces another simply because there's some accident of cost being lower in that new production method or something. Nothing to do with knowledge, just accidents of history. And it doesn't really seem like that's what you're interested in, right?
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, let's see. I've got a few more things to get to here before sort of opening things completely to general discussion. So how about we ask this question? So what would a science of technology disruption look like? Well, maybe it would have a few features. I have some suggestions here. We would imagine it would have a theory or a theoretical framework if there's sort of a collection of explanations, a collection of theoretical conjectures that clearly define the phenomena in question. So we're working on that, as you can see. That allows analysis to be undertaken that ultimately explains the phenomenon. So I think that as Karl Popper's approach and framing of science says, a theory is essential here. So we're not talking about an atheoretic approach. I think having a set of conjectures that offer explanation that can be improved, so that these explanations of this phenomenon can improve, can get better. We can continue searching for better explanations. I think that's a key piece here of what a science of technology disruption would look like. Second thing, of course, following from what I mentioned earlier, is that we would need a body of empirical evidence, of existing evidence, to which that theory can be applied. So we could ask what that might look like, but my team has been amassing this body of evidence for the last couple of years, and we now have several dozen historical examples throughout the ages, and a number of the recent ones have some decent data going with them in terms of metrics, parameters anyway, like market share, number of users, sales in a given industry, those sorts of things. So we've actually got some of that going back into the mid 1800s, when fairly reliable censuses started being taken. And then we would need some viable means of gathering new empirical evidence. So I think that that's fairly straightforward. We can continue to make observations and gather new data today. But that would certainly be, I think, necessary to have a science of this kind. And then ideally, and I think we can do this as well, we need the potential to make meaningful predictions. And by meaningful, I tend to think of along the terms of, well, the predictions need to be useful, they need to be measurable, they need to be falsifiable. But in any case, some meaningful, however you want to construe that, some meaningful predictions about current or future technology disruptions, instances of this general phenomenon that we're interested in. And if we have those ingredients, then I think that would look an awful lot like a science of technology disruption. So before I open that to discussion, and I think that would be, I think that maybe that is something that we can, spend some time on in general discussion. Let me just add a couple of key points, and so if you guys could just postpone questions for just another couple of minutes. Immediately following on from that, one should probably ask, does a science of technology disruption already exist? I mean, is this already a thing? Or is this a silly exercise if this entire field already exists? And the answer, as far as I can tell, is no. Don't see anyone else at the moment or historically undertaking, a search for good explanations that meets these criteria that we've laid out. I don't see any evidence that that's been undertaken. There are lots of technology forecasters, tons and tons. There's tons of prophesying and prognosticating and all kinds of, there are all kinds of industry experts whose whole business is predicting the future of a specific industry. Industries and even individual companies employ their own sort of outlook and forecasting teams but these folks don't approach that undertaking in what I would call a scientific manner. And it's plagued with problems, and the quality of the analyses and the predictions suffers, I think, as a result of that. Many very low quality predictions happen, and then of course, there's a lot of conflict of interest. Right? So an example I like to use is, how much stock would you put in the predictions of Kodak in 1995, the year the first consumer digital camera came out? They were probably not doing a great job of predicting the future of digital cameras, at least publicly, because the incentives were all upside down for making accurate predictions, among other things. So I don't think we see that this already exists. I certainly don't see anybody else using the tools that my team uses any better than we do. So we have a theoretical framework, and I can talk about that. I don't want to get bogged down in it too much, but we have a theoretical framework that one of the founders of my organization developed, SIBA Technology Disruption Framework. And I don't see other teams citing historical evidence to make their cases. A lot of it just seems to be pulled out of thin air. So I don't think that we have any compelling reason to believe that there is a thriving science of technology disruption already that's being executed with any rigor anywhere. I just don't see it. I could be wrong. I would love to be wrong, but I as far as I can tell, that's not the case. And then the final question to ask here is it worth doing this? Is this exercise worthwhile? Is this something we should even be bothering with? And again, that's an open question. I have my own sort of personal biases and feelings about this. Obviously, that's not a neutral, not an objective view, because this is partly how I make my living. doing analyses of this kind. But I think that there could be a lot of value to this because many mistakes appear to be being made, and those mistakes are consequential. Let me just give you several examples real quick, and then I'll end. The first is some of the investments that we make in industries that look like they are going to be disrupted by new technology, or rather are probably already in the process of being disrupted. A big example is the energy sector. So clean energy, as far as our analyses suggest, clean energy seems to be a textbook example of technology disruption coming for an entire sector. And misallocation of investment in the energy sector today already, at least according to our analysis, is in the trillions, trillion with a T, trillions of dollars. So it has been suboptimal to invest in coal power plants, for example, for at least 10 years now, at least, because of the lifetime of those power plants. The expected lifetime of a coal power plant is 40 years. But we should have been able to see that clean energy was coming and disruption was imminent 10 years ago. So the last 10 years, any investment in a coal power plant was not a good idea. And so that's just one example in the energy sector. Another example is city and transportation planning. So we still are planning our cities as though cars are never going to be electric and they're never going to be able to drive themselves. That's probably not good planning. And the final example that I've published on recently is climate change, where our scenarios and our planning are all based on assumptions that we are going to continue to see greenhouse gas emissions from the energy sector, the transportation sector, and the food sector, which together are about 90% of all global greenhouse gas emissions, those three sectors, that they are going to continue on a linear trajectory, and that decarbonization is going to be a slow and linear process taking place over many decades. And if that is incorrect, and failing to understand disruption has serious consequences that are relevant to planning for climate change. So I guess this is my way of very briefly making the case for why developing a science of technology disruption would be worthwhile. And so with that, I guess I'll just open it up completely to general conversation and questions. And if anybody has any strong feelings or suggestions about where we might take this seminar going forward, I have some ideas, but where we could go from here, I would love to hear those as well.
Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Adam.
Great. Thanks, Adam. I won't hog the floor with questions because I can ask Adam anytime.
But those questions may stimulate other ideas and thinking, so don't withhold all of them, Dan.
I'll hog the floor. You asked for other areas that might be doing something like this. A couple of things came to my mind. So I'm not sure how rigorous and academic this is, but in the AI safety community, so this is the group of people who are kind of trying to predict the future of the development of artificial intelligence, and in particular looking out for its kind of worst case consequences coming from sort of misuse or accidents from the power of the technology. I think people look at kind of trying to predict the rate of technological change. It's not quite the same as disruption, I guess, but they do talk about things happening quite rapidly because there are kind of feedback loops that come in when you, for example, increase artificial intelligence tools and then apply those tools into the development of future artificial intelligence tools. So I wonder if you looked into this kind of literature. I'm not sure how much of a literature there is, but if you've looked into this kind of area.
Yeah, it's we have sort of maybe you might call it a love-hate relationship with the not the community, but I would say the literature is focused specifically on the specifically on advances in information technology. So, the accelerating improvement in computation per unit cost or something like that. I mean, this is just a stratospheric example of nonlinearity in technological improvement, and it's for goodness sake, it's gone on for so long. I mean, I think it's been popularized by notable figures like Ray Kurzweil. He's a bit of a kook, frankly, although pioneering in many ways in his thinking, but in some ways, information technology is a great example, and then in other ways, it's almost such a stellar, astounding example that it isn't easy to generalize from to other forms of sort of sigmoid technological improvements, where something will come along and it'll really turn an industry upside down. But that'll happen in 15 years, and then there'll be a new sort of status quo for a generation or two before the next disruption comes along for that industry. And computing has been different because it just keeps going and going and going and going, and it's just unbelievable. So I guess I'm as exciting as it is, and in many ways we can point to computing and information technology even more broadly than that as an example of where feedback loops drive non-linear improvements. I'm not sure how well that individual instance generalizes to other forms of technology, and it would be great to think about that. I guess one thing that is a complicating factor in my mind is that what we mentioned before, this tree and lineage, because information technology and computing, they are at the root of so many other technological advances now. I mean, everything, it seems, under the sun is part of the feedback loop that includes improvements and advances in computing. But when I say computing, I mean hardware. I mean all of the software, all of the mathematics and theory behind physics, everything behind what goes into this incredible, ongoing, ceaseless, exponential improvement in our information and computing capacities. So it's hard to tease those out from other technologies in some way. So yeah, it's that's. I mean, again, I don't have answers to all this. These are important things to discuss and think about.